Andy Griffith. This weekend marks the third anniversary of Syria's civil war.
What began as isolated protests against the Assad government has become what some are calling the worst humanitarian crisis in modern times. John Waddy has more.
Early in 2011, while seeds of the Arab Spring were germinating, signs of Syrian uprisings, protests against the country's dictator, President Bashar Assad, began to appear on YouTube. Those protests would mushroom into a full-scale 3-year civil war with staggering costs. More than 140,000 dead and at least a third of the country's 23 million people forced to flee their homes. Millions of refugees are now living in camps in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Syria is rated one of the world's most dangerous places for children, and thousands have been murdered. The war also helped produce chaos in U.S. foreign policy.
To use potential weapons of mass destruction on civilian populations crosses another line, and that is going to be a game changer.
One result, reduced U.S. influence in the Middle East and allied skepticism that America will make good on its commitments. Assad resurfaced in Damascus this week, a sign he's not overly worried by threats from Europe and Washington. In the meantime, radical Islamists in the Syrian opposition, some tied to al-Qaeda, make life dangerous for Christians and other Syrian minorities. They held a group of Orthodox nuns hostage for months, recently letting them go after receiving a ransom. The rebels also have attacked historic Christian towns, targeting churches and monasteries. In the town of Raqqa, they're forcing Christians to convert to Islam, pay a tax, or, quote, face the sword. Many Christians have died, and thousands, such as Nicholas George, have fled.
Because of the fighting, everyone in my area was stuck inside their house. They could not buy anything. It was very dangerous for me even to try to open my shop.
Diplomats meeting in Europe have tried to forge an agreement between the warring factions, but plumes of smoke rising in Syrian cities signal that the end to the crisis is not at hand.
If you were, I think, a Christian father in Syria looking at your children and their future, I think you'd want them to get out, and not just now for safety, but for the future too. I think you'd be saying, go to Europe, go to America.
John Waggy, CBN News.
For more on this, we turn now to Tony Bedron. He's a research fellow specializing in Syria at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Tony, is there any end in sight to the civil war in Syria?
This seems to be a protracted conflict, especially in the absence of a decisive interference. The regime has outside supporters on its side. However, that has not seemed to have tilted the battle decisively in its favor. It's making some incremental gains in certain areas. On the opposition side, however, there has been no decisive outside factor to help push it in the opposite direction.
Tony, the Assad regime has used chemical weapons on its own people, as you know. Should the world, including America, be doing more to stop the Syrian government?
Without question. I mean, this is a regime that has used all kinds of illegal methods of warfare against its own people, mind you, not against an outside enemy, from chemical weapons to indiscriminate bombing of civilian neighborhoods to starvation. There is no question that the West has talked a big game but has done relatively little to nothing to actually support those on the other side, because it really doesn't have yet, I don't think, a clear end game of what it wants to see in Syria. It says it wants the Assad regime out, but then also it says that it wants to have some continuity in the so-called institutions of the state, which really don't exist anymore. So there's really a lot of strategic confusion on the side of the United States in particular, and that has translated on the ground in Syria as well.
What do you think comes next for Syria?
I think for now we are going to see continued bloodshed and protracted conflict. The regime, like I said, has been making certain gains in certain areas, taking advantage of the fact that it has really a free hand to do whatever it wants ever since it signed that chemical weapons agreement with the international community. It's been given effectively leeway to pursue warfare as it pleases. So it will continue to take advantage of that. backed by Iran and Hezbollah and a multitude of Iraqi Shiite militias on its side, as well as the Russians. But, it's just taking bite by bite at this point, inch by inch, as opposed to sort of a massive, decisive battle that tilts the whole momentum to its favor. So I think we're going to continue this kind of dragged out, grueling, bloody process that we've been seeing for the last 3 years, unfortunately.
Okay. Tony Bedran of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks for your time, sir.
My pleasure.